September 8, 1946, Moscow. Over the paving stones of Red Square with a celebratory march passes the Kantemirovskaya Tank Division. Roar of the engines, clank of the tracks, shine of the armor. In this fashion, the USSR for the first time was celebrating the Tankers' Day. This holiday was put in place by the order of Presidium of the Supreme Council of July 11, 1946, in honor of glorious victories of Russian tankers on the fields of the Great Fatherland War. This order also celebrated the creators of these fearsome vehicles, tank engineers. Throughout the time, tank forces were called differently. In 20s, armored forces. In the beginning of 30s, motomechanized forces. Only by 40s in their name started curating the word tank. Then they were called Auto-Armored Tank Forces. From 43 till 54, they were called Armored Tank and Mechanized Forces. And from 59 until this day, simply Tank Forces. Not only the name was subject to change, the role of the tank was changing too, from the means of support to one of the main striking forces of the ground troops. The end of the 19th, beginning of 20th century. Mundane had become trains, cars, invented the internal combustion engine. The first airplane was about to take off. Fast-paced technical progress was one of the defining characteristics of that era. Sooner or later, all this new technology was catching the eye of the military. Train became the first one to be called on duty. During the Civil War in North America, it was first used as a transport. Later on, cannon was installed on its rail base, and its carriages became armored. In this way, in 1862, first armored train came to life. Past nearly 40 years, in the very end of 19th century, armored trains made their appearance in Russia. It is understandable that the use of such unit is limited. The dependency from the railroads is obvious. There was a need for a different type of technology. It had to combine in itself the firepower and the mobility. With that in mind, in the beginning of 20th century, military engineers transformed a civil car into a military vehicle. The project of the first Russian armored vehicle was designed by Knyaz Nikolai Nakashidze. The construction of the prototype was entrusted to a French company that had an experience in creating military technology. In March of 1906, the armored vehicle was delivered to Russia. It had a mass of 3 tons and could reach for its time a respectable 64 kilometers an hour. It was armed with 2 machine guns. First one placed in the rotating tower, while the second one was kept inside the vehicle as a backup. The armor allowed to fend off no more than a bullet. It did not get adapted to service. The army was dissatisfied with the vehicle's protection, low maneuverability, and the shooting accuracy. After the tragic death of Nakashidze in 1906, the work on the vehicle was discontinued. Other developments of domestic inventors existed only on paper. Therefore, Russia did not have its own armored vehicles and would buy foreign ones only in single examples and purely for testing purposes. August of 1914 marked the beginning of the First World War, during which Russia's main opponent was Germany. From the get-go, the Russian army had to face the German armored vehicles. The armored cars, equipped with machine guns, penetrated the army rear, inflicting noticeable damage. In this situation, Russian Army Command addressed the idea of equipping the army with this new type of weaponry, especially since Russia's allies of the time, Britain and France, already had their own armored vehicles. First armored vehicle for the Russian army was made on the base of the car Russobalt. It was armed with Maxim machine guns. In October of 1914, 8 vehicles were sent to the front line. The only factory that produced cars in Russia was Russo-Baltic plant. But its production volumes were not enough. The demand for armored cars was constantly increasing. Therefore, a special commission was sent to England, where they ordered to build 48 Austin-type armored vehicles. Austin was armed with 2 Maxim machine guns, located in rotating towers, which significantly increased the shooting angle that on its turn increased the efficiency of the gunfire. However, the car had a big flaw. Its armor was very thin. Therefore, in Russia, decision was made to modify it by increasing the thickness of its armor from 4 to 7 millimeters. Other foreign armored vehicles were also subject to import, but according to Russian military, they were also in need of modernization. Main work was directed to improve the chassis and the firepower of the vehicles. With that goal, by the order of the staff captain Vladimir Gebrov, on the French Renault, for the better protection, the front armor plates were installed under an angle. An English armored vehicle White was additionally fitted with a 37mm cannon. Due to the high demand, armored vehicles were also made on the basis of foreign civil vehicles. This is how American truck Harvard was turned into a heavy gun vehicle with a 76mm cannon. Harvard had one interesting feature. Due to its design, it could go with the same speed forward as well as backward. One of the models was called Dobrynya. Other armored vehicles were also given names. Besides the foreign machinery, a part of Russian army were whole Allied units. In 1915, 350-strong division from Belgium arrived in Petergov. Emperor Nicholas II personally conducted its review. It consisted of 6 light and 20 cargo vehicles, as well as 18 motorcycles and 130 bicycles. The unit was led by 6 cannons, 4 machine guns, and 3 commanding armed vehicles. In 1 month, in January of 1916, the Belgium division headed to the front line. In the First World War, armored vehicles took on a wide range of tasks. For example, in order to overcome wired fence, armored truck Jeffrey was fitted with a special device that allowed it to open passes to the rows of barbed wire for the infantry. The device was designed by the staff captain of Russian Army, Dmitry Poplovkov. First World War gave rise to other types of armament as well. Over the battlefield started appearing airplanes. Now armored vehicle had to face this new type of menace as well. In order to deflect the attacks from the air, the machine guns on Austins were adjusted for anti-aircraft fire. Nevertheless, throughout the course of the war, it became evident that the armored vehicle wasn't the type of tech that could breach through the enemy defenses. There was a need for a new weapon. But how would it look like? Could it look like this? These armored wheelbarrows, how to describe them in any other way, though with no result, were tested by the French. Though it seems like the army command decided that it would not be fit for a soldier to be on his knees in front of the enemy. By the way, one of the first variations of the battle machine was invented by Italian Leonardo da Vinci. The 15th century scientist wrote, "We will build closed and impenetrable chariots, which could advance inside the enemy lines and would be immune to enemy attacks, while the infantry could follow them without the burden of carrying supplies." Something similar in June of 1915 was presented to the Technical Committee of the main military administration. Author of the project, some by the name of Ivan Simchishin, from the city of Lvov, but a citizen of Austria, attached to the blueprints added an explanation letter. It was addressed to none other than Emperor himself. As it became evident from the letter, the Austrian citizen did not possess a great knowledge of Russian. To the all-merciful Emperor, presenting to you a project of a machine for a destruction of enemy fortifications called Oboy, and humbly dare to ask for your approval and conditions under which I can create a model. For my lack of Russian, I ask for your forgiveness. To your Imperial Majesty, humbly, Semchishin. In his creator's idea, inside an ellipsoid, besides the moving machinery, were located wireless telegraph, living and storage quarters. The corpus of the machine was proposed to be made of 100 mm thick metal sheets. The enormous machine, with a height of few hundred meters, was to reach a speed of 500 km per hour, and according to the project, did not need any weapons. The enormous egg-like machine would simply smash anything that would stand in its way. After examining the blueprint, the technical committee came up with a verdict. An ounce, proposed by Semchishin machine under the name Aboy, unfeasible. The project was truly utopian, but it embodied the core idea: total destruction of the enemy defense. The thing is that the First World War was a trench war. Its characteristics were well-defended front lines, combined with machine gun emplacements and engineering structures. Preemptive artillery strikes were not that useful, since the enemy defense consisted of multiple lines. The range of fire was enough to suppress the first line. To continue the advance, the artillery had to be moved forward, which took too much time. The defenders had time to pull their reserves. A good example of this was the Battle of Verdun in February of 1916. For the battle with French army, Germans had prepared for about a month and a half. They employed more than 1,000 cannons and used more than 14.5 million shells. The losses from both sides were a staggering 1 million men. The confrontation lasted for 10 months. Result? Advancement of the German army for mere 3 kilometers. Evidently, the means of defense were prevailing over the means of attack. There was a demand for a vehicle that would serve as a greater means of attack than the armored car. It was necessary to increase the armor and the armament, though it inevitably led to the increase in the weight of the wheeled vehicle, and as a result would decrease its patency. One of the solutions of this problem became the installation of the caterpillars. A caterpillar consists of the number of links, called tracks. Its movement is initiated by the driving wheel, that is in constant contact with its links. The roll of the driving wheel can be executed by the front as well as the rear wheel. Support rollers equally distribute the weight of the vehicle throughout the contact surface of the caterpillar, which makes it easier to move on the soft ground. One of the first projects in Russia of a vehicle on a caterpillar base was developed by an engineer, Vasily Mendeleev, son of the famous scientist. As a matter of fact, the work on it, Mendeleev started well before the war. According to his project, the mass of the machine was going to be 170 tons, the thickness of its armor 150 millimeters, projected speed 24 kilometers per hour. The armament consisted of Maxim machine gun and 120 millimeter cannon. The prototype was never built. Similar project but smaller in size was presented by Alexander Porokhovnikov. Contrary to Mendeleev, he even managed to build a working prototype, though without tower. It was called the cross-country vehicle. During the tests in the May of 1915, the vehicle on the Caterpillar base reached a speed of 64 km per hour and overall looked promising. It just required the addition of the tower. But Germans were getting closer to Riga, where the cross-country vehicle was being built. Quick evacuation had to be made. With that, the testing of Porokhovnikov's armored vehicle was over. There existed another more ambiguous project. To increase the vehicle's patency, its author, engineer Nikolai Lebedenko, proposed to use not caterpillars, but the good old wheels. In 1915, he demonstrated a small prototype of his vehicle to the Tsar Nikolai II. It was put in motion by a gramophone spring. The ruler was delighted how easily the toy was overcoming the volumes of loss of Russian Empire scattered around the floor. As a result, Nicholas II ordered to provide the funding for the realization of said project. For the construction of the vehicle, a grand total of 200,000 rubles was spent, an enormous money for that time. In August of 1917, 40-ton monster with a wheel diameter of 9 meters moved from its place. After driving a few meters and crumbling a long bridge, the mastodon got stuck in the first ditch. It stayed there for 7 years, until in 1942 it got taken apart for scraps. This and many other projects were never continued. Things were going differently in other countries. On January of 1916, in England, was built the armored vehicle Big Willie. The head of the project, Colonel Swinton, called his creation Tank. This word reflected the shape of the vehicle, which allowed to hide the real military function of the machine for the time being. It was announced that, as if by the order of the Russian government, Britain was building self-propelled reservoirs for fuel. To make it more believable, British wrote on each tank, "Caution, Petrograd." In February of 1916, prototype of Big Willie passed its first testing, and in just a month, Britain started its mass production. To the service it was adapted under a name Mk1. Tank Mk1, mass 28 tons, crew 8 men, engine 105 horsepower, top speed 6 km per hour. First military use of this tank is known to be September 15th of 1916, during the battle on the river Soma, where 6 British tanks made an appearance. Mk1 were produced in 2 modifications, male and female. The main difference between two was its armament. Female had 6 machine guns, while male had 4 machine guns and 2 cannons. The vehicle was enveloped in sheets of hardened steel. Half-a-meter wide caterpillars were sliding by special rails that ran across the tank's whole body on both sides. The tank came out big and hard to maneuver. The comfort of the crew was out of question. The temperature inside the vehicle could reach a staggering 70 degrees Celsius. At times, the tankers would come out of the hellish vehicle disregarding the enemy fire to catch some fresh air. The observation from the tank was conducted through unprotected openings, and external or internal means of communication were non-existent. As you can see, from the technical point of view, English novelty was far from being perfect. Nevertheless, Mk1 became the first mass-produced tank in the history of the world. First French tanks, Schneider and Chamon, also came out very clumsy. Therefore, in 1917, France made a fundamentally new tank, Renault FT-17. This vehicle, with a mass of 7 tons and a crew of 2 men, weighed 4 times less than the British Mk1. Its engine was located in the rear, but the main feature that set Renault aside from its predecessors was the turning tower. This novelty allowed significant increase in the firing zone. Most of the tanks in the world will be built in the image of Renault. The layout scheme of rear engine and turning tower till this day is considered to be a classic. Renault was equipped with so-called tail. With its help, the tank could overcome large trenches and ditches, though it wasn't always the case. By the way, on the background are not French but German officers that are curiously examining a trophy Renault. Surprisingly, the German military did not believe in tanks in the beginning. Neither the intelligence information nor the use of tanks by the enemy, and not even captured trophies, succeeded in impressing the German high command. Germans failed to see the enormous potential of the tanks due to their technological shortcomings. As Berlin papers wrote, tanks are ridiculous fantasy and quakery. These beast vehicles only for a short time amaze the soldier. But soon the healthy soul of the German soldier calms down and he fights with the stupid chunk of metal with ease. After a late epiphany, Germany managed to build its first tanks only in the end of war, 2 years later than England. German A7V weighed 30 tons, which was 4 times heavier than British Mk1. The vehicle could reach respectable for its time speed of 13 km per hour. When the first A7V came off the factory line, the war was coming to an end. By the time when the peace treaty was signed, November 11th of 1918, Germany produced only 15 tanks. Meanwhile, England produced more than 2,000 MKs of different modification, and France about 3,500 light Renaults. Of course, tanks of the First World War were far from being perfect. They would constantly break, were very slow, and their armor could be penetrated by high-caliber bullets, let alone artillery shells. However, the battles that the tanks were a part of showed that during the massive attacks, these caterpillared vehicles can overcome the echelon defense of the enemy. After the signing of the peace treaty, European countries had time to design and create better war vehicles. However, things were different in Russia. The end of the war did not bring peace to the country. In October of 1917, Bolsheviks came to power. For the protection of their conquests, they were in dire need of modern means of warfare, including tanks. At first, this problem could be solved only in one way: by the repair of the armored vehicles left from the Tsar's army. The country was in state of civil war. In this condition of poverty and devastation, there were no means of production of its own armored vehicles. Therefore, it was easier to simply maintain the ones already in service. Though soon an opportunity presented itself. In March of 1919, during the battle with the armies of General Denikin, not far from Odessa, Red Army captured few Renault FT-17s. It was decided to send one of the vehicles to Lenin as a present, in order to find out what should be done with these trophies. Exactly a year ago, in March of 1918, in his speech during the fourth All-Russian Gathering of Soviets, Lenin said, "In war, takes over the one who has the best technology, organization, discipline, and machines. Without machines and without discipline, it is impossible to live in a modern society. We either need to adopt a better technology or be crushed." The said reflected thus: the new country of Soviets was in need of modern weapons. And now, there was a chance to implement that idea. The capture of Renault tank was very fortunate. The Red Army could only dream about this kind of vehicles. Lenin immediately ordered to organize the domestic production based off of the Renault. In fall, the trophy was delivered to Soramovsky plant of Nizhny Novgorod, where momentarily a project started under the command of engineer Nikolai Khorulov. On August 31st of 1920, tank drove out of the factory gates. The report of the engineers read, "A full testing procedures were made and the tank presents itself a reliable military unit." Officially, it was called Renault Russian. Light tank Renault Russian. Mass 7 tons. Crew 2 men. Weapons 37mm cannon and 7.62mm machine gun. Engine 34 horsepower. Top speed 8 km per hour. According to the traditions of the time, the tank was given a name: Fighter for Freedom, Comrade Lenin. Other tanks followed: Paris Commune, Proletariat, Victory. The built vehicles did not differ from their French ancestor, besides small modifications that included reinforcement of their armor, strengthening of the engine, and additional machine gun in the tower. In total, during a year and a half of production, 15 tanks were made, although none of them took part in the Civil War. By the time they were completed, the war was over. A more widespread during the Civil War got the armored train. The Red Army alone had more than 200 of them. They were in possession of the White Army as well. The dependency from the railroads did not go anywhere, but before the revolution, Russia built well enough developed railroad system. At least the armored train could drive up to the dense populated areas and support the infantry during their attacks or help them defend their position. And its armament was much better than that of a tank. The armored trains would appear unexpectedly and strike a strong blow to the enemy forces. By the end of the Civil War, besides trains, the Red Army also had 52 special units that were equipped with armored vehicles. They mainly consisted of armored Austins. The purely tank units were scarce, just 11, and only 6 of them had tanks. Practically half of the tanks were in need of major repairs. But overall, the goal was not to repair the old machinery, but to build new one. In 1924, USSR started a military reform. Within its framework, the Military Technical Command of the Red Army was created. The engineering and the production of the domestic military vehicles were entrusted to the Special Commission of the Tank Development. During its first meeting, this commission made a decision to concentrate its efforts on creation of light and maneuverable tank. This decision was dictated by the tough situation in the country. Strict economy of resources was required. There was simply not enough steel for bigger tank, and creation of even a small tank took time. Only 3 years after the start of the reform, in June of 1927, testing phase entered the tank T-18. Its main engineer was Vasily Zaslavsky. A month later, tank was admitted to service under abbreviation of MS-1, which meant Small of Escort 1. Light tank MS-1, mass 5.3 tons, crew 2 men, weapons 37mm cannon and 6.5mm dual machine gun, engine 35 horsepower, top speed 16.5 km per hour. There it is, first mass-produced Soviet tank. It was manufactured in Leningrad's Bolshevik plant. In its base stood the same old Renault. Renault caught the attention of many others besides Soviet Union. This tank was on service of the many countries, such as Italy, America, Japan. Some would simply buy this vehicle, some built their own based off of it, with making changes in its construction. In USSR, the main work was being done on the improvement of its chassis. With this goal, the support rollers were fitted with rubber rims, and the biggest innovation became the spring-fitted suspension. As a result, the smoothness of the ride had increased. The MS-1 had a cannon as well as a machine gun. In the end of 20s, it was the only serial light tank with such armament. Curiously enough, the aiming of the cannon was made by physical force of the crew member. To change the position of the tower, the gunner used the shoulder and back support levers. In total, about 1,000 of those tanks were made. They soon arrived in the service of the Red Army and were in use till the end of 30s. Its frontline debut, this tank had during the conflict on the Chinese border in 1929. It momentarily revealed the low reliability of the machine. During the military action, 7 of those vehicles went out of order, all due to technical problems. The patency of the tank was also found to be unsatisfactory. It could not overcome trenches of more than a meter wide. It had to find ways around them. It was impossible to perform the main shot on the go, and it had a low caterpillar resource. Nevertheless, the MS-1 was a step. The engineering decisions made during its construction became the basis for domestic tank development. The armored vehicles were not forgotten either. Most successful example of which is the armored car BA-27. In its base served the domestic truck AMOF-16. The BA-27 could reach respectable 30 km per hour. It was armed with 2 machine guns and a cannon. The armor was made from 4 to 8 mm thick metal sheets. The production of BA-27 was organized at the Izhevsk plant in Leningrad. In total, 150 units of this vehicle were made. The armored cars had their own advantage. They could move much faster than tanks in good road conditions, had higher range, were used for reconnaissance, and as means of communication between command posts. The tank MS-1 and the armored car BA-27 were the first humble attempts to create domestic armored vehicles. Though it was proving to be a hard task, noticeable was the lack of experience, production volumes, and staff. Overall tendency was such that the tanks were getting more and more attention, though their tactics and use were not fully developed in USSR as well as the rest of the world. And the abilities of the tanks left much to be desired. In just few years, the situation will rapidly change. Their appearance would make armored vehicles of various purposes. Those would be light and heavy tanks, powerful self-propelled guns, tankettes, flamethrowing, swimming, and even jumping tanks. In the close future, tank was destined to become a key figure on the battlefield.
А поле боя держится на танках. Взревут моторы и сверкнет броня. По грязи, по врагам полустанков прорвут любую линию огня.